Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Derek Miller. I'm the president and CEO of the Salt Lake Chamber. We want to thank all of you for joining us for this webinar this afternoon on a very important topic. As Utah's largest business organization, the Salt Lake Chamber represents broad interests of over 63,000 plus employers across the state and more than 1.4 million employees. All of those employers and all of those employees have been learning how to adapt and even readapt over the last several months during the pandemic. And over the coming months, we will continue to exercise that skill as we adapt again as Utah students return to school in some form or fashion. What that form or fashion looks like will be different around the state, but it is important for everyone to be able to plan for continuity of their workforce. And so for this reason, we're pleased to be joined by a great panel today that are here to speak to you about what you can look forward to and how you can learn to adapt to your own personal needs, be that in your family, your household, or your business. To moderate and introduce the panel, I want to turn the time over to one of our great chamber members, Mark Holland, who is the president of Ascend Staffing. Mark, thanks for being here today, and I'll turn it to you.
Yeah, thank you, Derek. I appreciate it. As Derek mentioned, I'm president of Ascend Staffing. We've got about 2,500 employees out working today in 10 different states. And, you know, most of our employees are in that $12 to $20 range. And so this is a very important topic for us. And probably like many of our chamber members, we're personally invested in it as well. I've got a 14-year-old daughter that I've been talking to about this kind of stuff. My 18-year-old missed her last part of her senior year last year. And so it's very relevant for us. Very pleased to be able to moderate this discussion today. We've got a wonderful panel with us. So as we get started, I want to be able to introduce Sid Dickson. She's our State Superintendent of Public Education. Lexi Cunningham, our Executive Director of the Utah State Superintendents Association, and Larry Madden, who's right in the thick of it, the Salt Lake City School District, is our interim superintendent. So these three folks are principal thought leaders in education, and we're very honored to have them with us today. So as we begin, if I could ask you to just kind of give us an overview of what the scope of your world is like, who you report to, what are your specific responsibilities in the leadership framework, and then as you kind of walk through in your world, what are the trigger points that are going to be impacting us as we move forward? And then from there, and I can help bring this up again if we need to, but as we think about the soft closure in the spring, as we think about our dialogues with other schools and what we've learned, maybe each of you could share your perspectives there. If it's okay, Superintendent Dickson, can we start with you, and then Director Cunningham and Superintendent Madden? Does that work? Great. So Superintendent Dickson, we'll turn it over to you. And yeah, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you to all the chamber members. It's really an honor to be with you. I think you can see my screen. I assume you can. Should be a chart up on the screen. Mark, can you see that? Okay. So I thought I would start by just talking a little bit about who makes decisions. I think that's confusing to the public, and sometimes it's actually confusing to me. But we put this chart on our coronavirus.website to answer a lot of these questions. And this is at schools.utah.gov, or excuse me, schools.utah.gov/coronavirus. And we have all of our resources here. But this chart kind of shows who made what decisions. So in the spring, Governor Herbert consulted with the health department, the Utah Department of Health, brought me in, talked to others about what we needed to do with schools. And that decision was made in consultation, but the governor has the ability, and you can see the legal reference on the right-hand side of this chart. He has the ability to close schools at the state level in response to a public health emergency. So he did so. The State Department of Health can do it at a state level as well, and the local health departments can close local schools. In the spring, before the soft closure went into place, where we went into remote learning, there was a case of a student who contracted coronavirus, and this student had a sibling in a high school. So a charter school and a high school both closed down based on one case. And at the time, this was the worldwide phenomenon. We just didn't know much about the virus. Everybody was trying to find their way through it. So we used those levels of authority to make those decisions. Now, here we are trying to get back into school in a variety of ways. And the State Board of Education, for whom I work for, our 15 elected board members, they can make requirements and recommendations for opening schools, and they have the statutory and constitutional authority to do that. So our board felt that local control was very important, that we could have a set of requirements that were reflected in the governor's phased guidelines that the chamber has really been a part of, and play those out with a template so that each school, charter school and district, could say, based on our context, we think this is the important way to go. We also looked at the considerations for safe and healthy openings. So, looking at that decision-making process in regards to consulting with local health departments and determining should a situation be remote, maybe a hybrid model, or more in-person. And the things that we have to take into account are the patrons, the students, and the families and their conditions as well. So I will let Superintendent Madden talk to you about how they made that decision in Salt Lake, and Dr. Cunningham can talk more about that statewide, but I wanted you to see sort of this flow of information. In terms of what we did in starting, we really hunkered down and thought about what was essential when schools closed remotely in the spring. Many states prepared for that remote closure by spending at least 1 or 2 weeks just trying to get devices into homes and figuring out what to do. We're lucky in Utah in that we have a big digital teaching and learning presence. We actually are well known for that throughout the country. And in spite of us having so many devices and spending a lot of time on professional learning with our teachers, we still had a lot of families who were not connected by virtue of broadband, just not having access. Sometimes it was a language barrier. Sometimes students had to go take care of families while both parents worked, or maybe a parent lost a job. So the student went out and was actually working to help support the family. There were just a variety of scenarios. So we had, in some cases, about 30% of our students disconnected along the Wasatch Front. So we focused on feeding our students, making sure that learning happened, taking care of our classified employees. We had bus drivers delivering meals and packets and devices. We had classified employees painting rooms during the spring while students weren't there. Anything we could do to really make sure that everybody was gainfully employed. We really had to take care of social emotional needs, and we know that students were in toxic stress, and families were at home more. People lost their jobs, things were shut down, and so we know that there was a heightened sense of social emotional learning that needed to take place. And then as we moved into summer and thought about what needed to happen during the summer, really thinking about how we support remote learning by engaging our teachers in professional learning. For our districts and charters, many of them brought students back in small groups or one-on-one, especially our students with disabilities, our students learning English, who were really vulnerable to academic loss as well as some social emotional stress. And here we are in the fall. We're returning and we're trying to reimagine what schools will look like. We're looking at this not just as a COVID moment, but what can we do based on what we've learned to move forward and be more personalized in our learning. So that's the way we've approached it at the state board, and I'll flip it now to, I think it's coming to Dr. Cunningham. And if I'll come back to something else. Go ahead, Lexi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Derek and Mark and JC. Thank you for hosting this today. It's a privilege to be here. I have the opportunity to work with all of the state superintendents in the state of Utah, as well as school board members. And so I can tell you that as we began to transition from what we were doing in the spring into our remote learning, the minute that transition was made, our school boards and our superintendents already began thinking about what is this going to look like in the summer? What is this going to look like next fall? So throughout the late spring and this summer, schools and districts and school boards and communities and parents have been working on reimagining, rethinking, and redefining what school looks like. We have direction from the State Board of Education. We have a handbook and a reopening template that was developed with a lot of input from community partners. We have trained superintendents and principals and teachers on that template. Each district then created their reopening or restart plan based on that template. There are 41 districts in the state of Utah, and I can tell you that every single plan is a little bit different. Those plans reflect what has happened in the community in the spring and the summer. They take into account how many schools, counseling, how we're feeding students. And so our superintendents and our school boards worked throughout the summer to develop plans that were going to best meet the needs of their schools and their communities. We have remote schools where they've seen very few COVID cases, and they are ready to welcome all of their students back into the classroom with very few modifications. We have some schools along the Wasatch Front where they have had outbreaks of COVID, and then we have some schools that are really in a high-risk area right now and they won't be able to welcome students back. So I think what has been so helpful in this whole journey is having the handbook and having the plans and really seeing our districts work together, getting input from teachers, from parents, even reaching down into the ranks of students to ask students what they think would be best for them. I've had the opportunity to look at all of the plans, and I really have been impressed with the thought that has gone into the plans, how our district superintendents and how our school boards are listening to their teachers. They're taking into consideration what the needs of the teachers are. They're taking into consideration the needs of our students. Every plan has some type of online or remote learning. So if a parent chooses for whatever reason to keep their child at home, they can still be supported by a teacher through remote learning. And I think that that is really powerful, that we do have some parents that may wait until later in the fall to send their students back to school. I think throughout this, it's been really nice to see our superintendents and our school boards coming together, sharing ideas, talking a lot about what's working, what's not working, wanting to get feedback, because they really do want to do the very best by their students. And we understand as district leaders that school is about English and math and science, but it also is a place where we can feed students, we support students, we provide after school care and support for students. We have activities and athletics and all kinds of things that connect students to our school to make it so our kids are going to want to be in school. So I, as the working with USSA, have really just been supporting superintendents and school boards as they do the work of reimagining what school can look like in the fall.
Thank you.
I'll
And
pass it over to Larry now. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, and I just might mention that our chat feature is open. And so if you have questions for our panel, please send them on over and we'll get to as many of those as we can. So thank you, Dr. Cunningham. Yeah, please, Superintendent.
Yeah, so in Salt Lake City School District, I work with the school board district leadership to make the decision that we have made, which is to open with only remote learning at the start. So the plan as it is now is we would start on September 8th in a remote mode, and that we would revisit that. And I mean, the one thing I think we know for sure, this has kind of become normal, is in 3 weeks, something's going to be different. Maybe it's going to be worse, maybe it's going to be better, but we know it's going to be different. So we're going to kind of keep our eye on it as we move forward. And we've made a decision that we would make changes at kind of natural grading periods. And so the first time that we would possibly make a change would be in early October, and that would be a midterm for the first term. That way we can provide some continuity in doing that. So our decision was made by looking at the data. We had there was a ton of input and support from the state that was very, very useful. The handbook was very useful, guidance from the governor's office, and even the opportunity to make a choice, because originally we did not have the opportunity to make a choice in Salt Lake, given the orange status and the guidelines from the governor's office was we were in any area in the orange status would be in soft closure, and we were given some latitude within that. But even after we got that latitude in evaluating our situation, we have a couple of very highly impacted neighborhoods, and our boundaries in our schools, in particular for our high schools, cut across our district. And so while we have a couple of highly impacted neighborhoods, the students are spread around the district much more broadly than that. And so we looked at all those things. We talked with district leadership. We made some decisions on a proposal, which we took to our school board, and they approved that opening, and that's where we are today.
Yeah, thank you. So we've talked about some general concepts, and it'd be useful to maybe if we could talk about the 2 or 3 maybe key take-homes that we bring to this based on our experience with the spring, based on learnings from other sources, schools that are up and running, and so on. And so if there were 2 or 3 key points that we've learned from the history, the short history that we've been in. And Superintendent Madden, could we just go the other way, and could we start with you? And what are your 2 or 3 take-homes?
Well, I think we learned a lot in the spring. I mean, I think we learned that we were in emergency mode. When we originally went out, it was for 2 weeks, and we stayed out. I think what we learned is it was very, very difficult, but I think we also learned that it's doable. And so while we hear about some people having negative experiences, there were some really incredible things that happened. And some schools, some teachers kind of embraced this new environment. They figured out how to do groups remotely. They figured out how to connect with kids. And I think both Dr. Cunningham and Superintendent Dickson mentioned social emotional learning and the need for that. And it's huge. And so we had teachers that were getting kids together for lunch groups with each other, or bringing in counselors. We even had some teachers that got kids together just to play games and be kids together, because they were thrust into this world that is just not natural. I mean, when you're 12 or 13 years old, you want nothing more to be with your friends, and all of a sudden you're on lockdown. So I think that was really kind of the big takeaway. We've learned a lot. We knew we needed to train a lot of people, and we have trained a lot of people this summer. We've also focused on working off of one platform. So when we went out in emergency mode, people were grabbing whatever they could grab. Some were using Zoom, and some are using WebEx, and all kinds of different things. And now we've got everything. All of our teachers will put all of their classes on a Canvas platform. So while this is helpful for the district, it's helpful for parents, because now I've got one place to go. If I go to my student's Canvas page, if they have to have a Zoom meeting or they're going to use some online application, it's all on that one page. And then we're going to train parents in how to monitor that with their kids. We're also going to train some other folks in the community so that they can help parents understand how best to track that. But I think the one platform will be hugely helpful. And then also, I guess one final thing is the understanding that what quality education might look like in person, this is different. And so it's not as simple as I can just take my class and put it online. I can't just copy my worksheets and put them up. This is a different environment. And so it requires us to use different approaches, but it also offers us some opportunities that we didn't have before too. So I think we maybe talk about that more a little bit later, but I think there's some really excellent opportunities within all of this.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Cunningham, 2 or 3 key take-homes from our learnings?
I actually have 4, and I call them the 4 C's. And I think there are things that we've learned, and there are things that we can continue to work on. I think the first C for me is communication. We have learned a lot about how we need to communicate with our teachers, with our families, with our community. Communication there is no such thing as too much communication. And so really taking the time to figure out what communication tools you have as a district, use those, and use them over and over and over again. There is nothing wrong with sending out 3 different types of communication to get your message out. The second C for me is connection, and we have to address the connectivity issues that we have in some parts of our state. We did have students that did not have computers. They were not able to log in, and that is something that needs to be addressed. We also, with connections, learned, and I think that some of us made assumptions that we assumed that every one of our staff members has access to a computer at home and they could be accessing information from us, and that's not always the case. And so we have to really think about, if we're going to be online, how are we providing the tools and the resources to our families that don't have them so that they can stay connected with their schools. The third C is compassion. This is hard for teachers. This is hard for families. This is hard for students. Mr. Madden talked about a 12 and 13-year-old, what is this? Why can't I go back to school? It was really hard for our parents too. And I think that we have to show compassion. Everybody did the very best that they could. And it's a time to support each other, not criticize and tear each other down. So I think we have to remember to be compassionate, that this is going to continue to be hard because it's going to be very different. And then my fourth C is care. We have to really think about how we care about students, how we care about families. It became very clear that we were doing a great job of providing meals to our students, and they were getting breakfast and lunch, and in some cases dinner at some of our schools. But our families maybe had adults at home or other people at home, and they might need meals and things like that. So we have to really think about how we care about our students and our families, how we can support them with physical needs, how we can support them emotionally with counseling, with some social emotional help, and just do all that we can to come together as a community and care and wrap our arms around our students, our families, and our teachers to make sure that they have everything they need. So I think with communication, connection, compassion, and care, those are things that I learned a lot about going through this in the spring and in the summer, and hopefully we can do those 4 things better as we move into the fall.
Thank you. Yeah, Superintendent Dickson, 2 or 3 key learnings from the spring and other sources.
Yeah, I just want to put a big old exclamation point on what Superintendent Madden and Dr. Cunningham said. Completely echo their sentiments. I think just all of that, and maybe 2 things that I would add. One, for the business community, which is this audience here today, we have to understand that education is an ecosystem. And I think sometimes we think of education in a silo. Since the spring, every time I see a document come out that's business related or super focused on the economy, schools are tied to that. But I always say, what about schools? How do we fit into this equation in a very concrete way, not just an abstract way? So we're facing this pandemic crisis and talking about that, but I also want us to think about 2 other crises. So I'll just share this slide to illustrate. So as we think about our students going back, one of the things that I think we have to consider, oops, sorry about that, is these 3 crises, and they're all interrelated. So we have this uncertainty. We're so used to having routines in school, and parents know what to expect basically when they come to school. And there's kind of this basic routine, and then each teacher kind of has a little bit of a different spin on it. But you know what you're getting when you come into a school by and large. And we just have all of this uncertainty that we're all living in. And there's fear and frustration on the parts of some. So I love Dr. Cunningham's 4 C's. I think they're so important. And we just have to be okay with each other, knowing that we're in this unprecedented time. But then let's think about what else happened this summer. We had racial unrest, and it really opened up and unpacked and shine a light on racism that we have in our society institutionally, systemically. And so that really impacts the discussions that we'll have coming back into our schools. And that's an additional layer of things that we have to really tackle and make sure that each and every student feels safe in our school. For many of our students, as Lexi discussed and Larry discussed, school is the only safe place that they have. So there's another layer. And then again, layer that with the economic uncertainties. So we already know that we have more students who are going to be accessing food services, more students in the homelessness category, meaning that they just don't have a stable address and don't live in conditions that would be considered fit for a child. So if you look at comparative data a year ago, some are saying that in our state it's risen by 12%, the homelessness factor. So those are ways that business can help in terms of, if you are a broadband business or know of one, support getting broadband into all homes. And that's not just a COVID moment. That becomes an essential utility for all of our families. It's about being able for employers to access future employees. It's about all of our families being able to access information about school, about just general knowledge in their community. So that is like electricity and water now, broadband, and having access to that. Childcare is another big thing that we collectively can advocate for. We are a state and actually a country that's not really invested in universal quality, accessible, and affordable childcare. And that really impacts when we go into these hybrid and remote models of what do we do for working families where they can't be at home with their children, or even if you are, like the best of circumstances, it was really difficult. So Dr. Cunningham and Superintendent Madden addressed how we're mitigating that by providing better communication and resources for our parents and trying to cull down what we do with students to things that are very essential and meaningful and using one platform. So that takes all of us in that ecosystem.
Yeah, for families that don't have the ability to, or access to broadband, for example, what type of resources are we, how do we facilitate? How do we address those that can't learn remotely from home?
Yeah, our telecom companies have been very good, and we have some examples out in rural areas where they've leaned in, and I think Lexi can probably add to this, but I know even just using Community Cares Act funding, there were 2 LTE towers put into Ogden schools in kind of our most impoverished neighborhoods. We have hotspots going in. We have telecom companies who have really reduced their fees. And I think both Dr. Cunningham and Superintendent Madden, you've had experiences in Salt Lake with some of the things that have happened.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to address those.
Mm-hmm. I'd be happy to. I think that in our rural communities, you really saw communities coming together and using the resources they had in a multitude of ways. An example would be in some of our rural communities, they realized that students didn't have broadband, but they also realized that because students were taking buses to get to school, it was difficult to get meals to them. So in some of our rural schools, they outfitted their buses with Wi-Fi, and then they also loaded up meals on their buses. And so their bus drivers would pick up the meals for their students that they would usually pick up to take to school. They deliver those meals, and then they just park their buses in different parts of the community. So if kids needed to log on, if they'd been given computers from their school, they were able to log on. And so not only we were feeding kids, we were providing Wi-Fi, but we were also keeping our employees, our drivers, they had jobs that they were a part of helping. We've seen districts that have really used a lot of CARES money and invested in hotspots and are checking out not only computers, but hotspots so that families can log on to the computer. You've also seen schools in our rural communities and along the Wasatch Front. They have opened up the capability of their Wi-Fi networks at their schools. So if families needed something, they could drive into a school parking lot and they could have access to Wi-Fi. So there are just examples like that throughout the state where communities came together to support students and families who needed to have access to that.
Thank you. Superintendent Madden, I know you had a comment.
Oh, well, just those exact things. I think it would just be to repeat. I mean, we bought 600 hotspots. We've got 6,000 more laptops coming, and it's We did find also that, you know, we have a lot of big families, and sometimes we didn't have enough actual computers. And, you know, this year we're going to have some synchronous learning that's going to happen when we're remote. And so we've got to go a little bit further and make sure that, that every student in that household that needs a computer has one. But right now, I think I feel pretty positive about our capacity to do that. I think we're in a pretty good place. And we've also been working with local broadband to try to provide some support, and not just inexpensive broadband, but through our foundation, we can even support families where even the reduced rate is not accessible to them.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You mentioned that October 15th is the next kind of gate, if you will. Could you speak maybe so what about the other districts? Is that kind of a state? Yeah, or like, so our families in Davis County, for example, and what about others?
I think everybody made their, maybe Sid's the one to speak to this, but I think everybody made their decision with their local school board.
Okay.
And I meet with all the superintendents in the county, and I know that Murray starts on Monday. There's some districts that are going 4 days a week. I think it's quite a variety, actually. Maybe Sid's better to speak to that.
Yeah, we have three basic models. So we have, as been mentioned, we have a remote model, which Salt Lake District is really pretty much full into remote and checking in at points and really equipping families and their most vulnerable students. We're really proud of Salt Lake District. And we have some hybrid models, as you've mentioned, in Davis, where they're both remote and in-person learning to cut down on numbers. And then the bulk of our districts, especially along the Wasatch Front, have made some adjustments to in-person learning, where they're going remote on Friday and then releasing students a little bit early in the day. And that keeps us nimble. Like that's the key at any given moment. If we have to quarantine a class or part of a class, or heaven forbid a school, that we can flip into that remote space. So that's something that our state has taken on to really have, when you look at every school plan, they've got these options so that at any given time, they can flip on and off a switch and move pretty seamlessly from one to another. Now, the key for that is what that means for families. And so families have to have backup plans as well. That if you go into remote and you're a working family, what's your backup plan for childcare and those kinds of things. So those three options are based on working with local health departments and determining what the community spread looks like, what the needs are of the families and the school. So there are a lot of factors that go into decision-making about when to move from one model to another. And I think our schools have been really good to prepare for that nimbleness.
Okay. In a good case scenario, if things are progressing, could it be a monthly kind of ratcheting up the process, if you will, more time with school, less time online, or is that just a district by district and we just have to communicate locally?
So the gating criteria is really, I mean, there's some general guidelines, but the gating criteria is really with local health departments. And we put some things in place about quarantine and classrooms and all of that, but really it comes down to checking in weekly. I think that both Lexi and Larry can tell you that they are engaged, as I am, with our local health leaders and our state health leaders to help make those decisions and check in. We had our first start today with Washington County School District, and we had a good report that things went smoothly. Kids kept their masks on. Kids and teachers were excited to see each other. So first day, first school district, good start.
One of our chamber members asked the question, how are school districts coordinating with after-school programs now that the full-day services and online school support? How can government and businesses support daycare infrastructure? And so anyone care to respond to that?
I can respond to that. Okay. I think that's a great question, and that has been a question since we went out in the spring. Many of our districts have been working with various after-school agencies, with daycare agencies to provide opportunities for students. We are making those connections throughout the state. even looking if schools have capacity or have extra room or space in their buildings, could an outside agency come in and possibly rent the facility or use the facility to support learning and support families and support students. I think that it's also important to realize that this is not only an issue for families, but it's also an issue for teachers who have school-age children or younger children. Where are they going to have their students or their children go? And so there's been a lot of work that's been done throughout the state to find different ways to support families, to support daycare. I think it's going to be important that businesses realize that there could be a scenario where one of their employees has a child who's in a room that needs to be quarantined, and that student that student and family may have to be quarantined for 14 days. And so I think there needs to, if possible, there needs to be some flexibility there. So we're all working together to figure out how we can support not only our K-12 students, but our after-school students and our pre-K students as well.
Related to that, we've got a couple of questions about temperature checking. Will that be happening on buses? Will that be happening at the entrances of schools? Can you tell us a little more about that?
I can speak to that. In fact, I was just trying to type into the chat. You know, in working with state and local health, they have indicated, just based on the little bit of longitudinal data that we have, that it's not an effective indicator. Kids are asymptomatic oftentimes. The congregation and the time it would take to take every temperature, which again, a student may not be manifesting a temperature. So we really shifted to having families own this, families and the adults in the system really own this item, where you need to symptom check, not just temperature check, but there's a whole list of symptoms that we expect to be checked on for every student every day before they come to school. The key is to keep it away from school. And that's true of the adults in the system as well. I know personally, I've been to a couple of medical facilities where it used to be always temperature check, and now it's a list of, it used to be temperature check and questions, and now it's a list of questions. So we're really expecting the community to lean in, and for our caregivers and our adults to really do that before they get to the door. Otherwise, think about the time and you've got kids bunched up taking temperatures that may not be the symptom that manifests itself.
May do more harm than good, right? All the kids mashed up trying to get
That's the concern.
To the school. Yeah, thank you. What are your main concerns? What are you hearing the most from parents? Are there a couple of themes or questions?
I think the big one for me is that I think there's a real concern that the fall will be like the spring. I think that's maybe the biggest one that I hear. And I get it. I understand, and it's on us to prove it. We've got a bunch of creative, hardworking people. I know that it's going to be much better, but I think for parents, they're going to have to actually see it. So we've structured things where we expect all of our teachers to send out schedules to parents, and they should know exactly what their student's doing through the week. So they should know when their student's going to be in synchronous learning or when they might have some asynchronous time. And then I think someone earlier, Julie, I think asked a question about parents working full-time and kind of the logistics around that. And so all of our teachers, when they open a session with a group of students, will record that session. So if I, as a parent, had my a younger child in daycare and I couldn't have them in the synchronous time during the day, I could go back and revisit that with on the weekend or in the evening. And so then we'll kind of take our attendance over the week by based on we've got like a little assignment that we'll have students do that'll tell us if they participated in all of these pieces along the way. So we're just trying to do whatever we can to make this workable. It's so hard for families, so incredibly hard, and it's it's just tough. Yeah.
So if we have a child that gets sick, how does that flow through? What is the process?
Lexi, do you want to take it?
Yeah, I'll go ahead. Each one of our schools, that was one of the things that was required for districts to have a plan on if a student gets sick in school. So each one of the reopening or restart plans has a process where they should have some type of quarantining room at the school. It is finding out, most of our schools will have health kits that might have thermometers where at that time they could take a temperature, getting in contact with a parent, really working hand in hand with the health department to notify the health department so that the health department can follow up with adults and with family members so that we can check with students. But it really is this working together and making sure everybody understands, stay home if you're sick, constantly asking, those questions about, how are you feeling today? If students are not feeling well, then they'll go to the office, they'll go to the quarantine room, working with the health department, working with our nurses, and just really being aware of where students are and how they're feeling throughout the day.
I know in some cases, if someone has direct contact and they test negative, there's still a quarantine. Could you explain a little more about that?
Well, the quarantine is actually, there are different levels of risk with quarantine, right? So you could be moving past somebody who tests positive, but it may not make you exposed. So it's really thinking about masks, mask distancing and duration, right? So all of those factors taking into account to determine the level of risk for exposure. And because we went away from a modified quarantine, that was first suggested because that's the way the business manual lays it out. But we've got into a full quarantine, which means that if there is exposure, then we quarantine students and classes and teachers, again, depending on those three variables. So masks are important, and it's not an either or, it's a mask and distancing, and then thinking about duration of the amount of time students were around each other and teachers. So that's where you'll start to see maybe a portion of a class or a whole class, a group of kids. We've already seen that on some of our after school teams or things that have been happening in the summer with kids practicing. And you might see 4 kids, 6 kids, 12 kids quarantined. So it provides a sense of safety, and rather than having kids who have been exposed come into the school and not knowing if they've been exposed or not. So that clarity and really working with our health department, as Dr. Cunningham described, is really critical. And we do have a point of contact in every school who has been identified and working with the local health department. So that communication stream is really critical. And every school has that person who will be trained by health departments on some of these protocols so that it's seamless across the state. That's the goal.
Mm-hmm. I also think it's important that everybody knows that every district's reopening plan is on their district website, so they can find out what each district looks like, and they can find out who the coordinating person is in each district and at each site.
That's very helpful to know, and thank you. And I know this isn't directly your purview, but what can you tell us about high school sports? How do you see that unfolding this fall?
You noticed we all smiled.
I know.
Well, we have games. We have athletes that we've already started playing games, and we have I think the first football game in the country is tonight between Davis and Harriman. So we do have students that have been participating in athletics. I think that in the spring, we had a large group of our spring athletes who lost that opportunity. And so we're hoping that they're going to have that opportunity this fall. The UHSAA, which governs athletics in the state of Utah, has been working with principals and athletic directors and coaches and athletes throughout the summer and throughout the beginning of this fall to put guidelines in place that will keep our students healthy, keep our coaches healthy, keep our fans healthy. Different districts are doing different things as it relates to athletics. For example, some of our districts are only going to have their football stadiums at 25% capacity for games. So they're giving parents an opportunity to get tickets, and then they'll open it up to other students and the community. We have coaches that are breaking their practices into smaller groups of students. Our athletes, all of our adults should be wearing masks. There should be socially distancing. So we really are trying to give our students the opportunity. And I think that what I encourage people to do is really think of athletics and those athletic teams and those coaches as an extension of the classroom. And if wearing masks and socially distancing is good in the classrooms, then we need to think about how we're going to do that on our fields of competition. But we have started, I think we had some soccer games going this week. I know in rural Utah, we started baseball this week. We've got football going. So our hope is that we can give kids those opportunities that help them succeed in school. So we're all working hard to make sure that they can have those opportunities.
Thank you.
For us in Salt Lake, we, when they made the changes to the orange status to allow us some latitude, that was relatively early on in July. And we decided at that point in time to allow our students to play sports. I'm not exactly sure if we would make the same decision now, to be honest with you. So we're monitoring it very closely, but we won't allow fans in our stadiums for football games, or well, actually for any events that we have in Salt Lake City. And so we've left some latitude for our teams to play away games if they prefer. Then they can get into the stadiums where they can at least have a few fans. But the truth is, I worry a lot about the contact sports, about football. I worry about soccer. Golf and tennis I think are pretty solid ground, but the team sports are definitely a worry.
And we have volleyball starting this weekend, correct?
Yeah.
Thank you. I think our final question, and unless somebody has another question they'd like to send in through chat, is, as business leaders, what can we do? How can we lend more support? Are there specific things that would be helpful for us that would help you?
So I would just say that as business leaders, you're all parents likely, or most of you are parents, and you have your own personal experience. So apply those 4 C's that Dr. Cunningham talked about. I think those are so critical, and really understanding the pressure that our schools are under. We went from being this academic place, this place of learning, to now one that really has amped up our care around social emotional learning, and just like those Maslow's basic needs, and then layer on all this toxic stress that our students have experienced. We haven't been around them for 5 months. So things are uncertain and parents feel uncertain. So first of all, in your parent role, lean in that way and just understand that everybody's trying to do the best they can, and then be easy on yourselves. I think our parents were so hard on themselves because they didn't feel like the perfect parent or the perfect teacher. From a business community, I think we have to lock pinkies and lock arms and say that broadband is an essential utility, and work to make that happen in our system. That childcare, access to quality childcare, affordable childcare is critical for our economy. And since the chamber is so tied to the economy, I think those are 2 things that really could be part of the chamber's mission and vision to help our education system move forward now and beyond COVID.
As a parallel question, any suggestions to us on how we can support our workforce with kids that are virtually learning? Have you come across best practices or suggestions that other folks that are doing?
Yeah, I think we're beginning to see some models across the country. If employers have the capability, maybe providing space in a business where maybe employees could bring their children, and there could be some computers there, and they could do work at work. Looking at some employee daycare centers and what that would look like. Maybe looking at some type of co-oping as it comes to daycare. I think those are some things that would be really helpful. I think too, just making sure that employees have flexibility if they need to pick up their student, or if they need to be home with their student. Are there ways that they can work at home? I think that's really important. And then getting back, I have one suggestion for about supporting teachers in schools. And I know it's really simplistic, but I think that if every employee that is a part of the chamber could just thank a teacher, thank a bus driver, thank a principal. Just send an email and say, you matter, you're important. I think the words thank you right now, when people have just been working so hard, would go a long way, and it would make people feel like my job matters and what I'm doing is really important to the community.
Thank you. Well, before I turn this back over to Derek, let me just, we're so grateful for the work that you do. It's awesome to have such wonderful thought leaders in our state. And I feel so much better, frankly, personally, as a parent and as an employer after this discussion. So thank you for the tremendous job that you're doing. And with that, Derek, I'll turn it back to you.
Well, let me just echo your comments, Mark, and thank these panelists, not just for spending time with us, which is certainly valuable. And it's a valuable commodity under the best of circumstances, but under the current circumstances, the fact that they would spend some time with our chamber members is remarkable, and I thank them. So thank you, Lexi, and thank you, Larry, and thank you, Sid, for not just the time, but everything you're doing to help our students. And I would just conclude by saying it's not just educational, it's not just economical, but it's also an emotional issue. And so everything you're doing to navigate those challenging waters, you have our thanks for, and wish you the best. Thanks everyone for joining us today. This will conclude the webinar.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.